In every mythic age, there are figures who stand apart, not because they wield thunderbolts or rule kingdoms, but because of their minds. Daedalus was such a figure. He was not a god, nor a warrior, nor even a king. He was a craftsman, an inventor, a thinker who could shape wood and stone into miracles. The Greeks remembered him not only as a builder of things, but as the very embodiment of ingenuity. If Prometheus gave mankind fire, Daedalus gave them invention, solutions to problems that seemed unsolvable, structures that defied imagination. Daedalus was said to be born in Athens, a city that prided itself on cleverness and art. From a young age, his skill was unmatched. He carved statues so lifelike they seemed ready to move. He crafted tools that no one had seen before, turning raw materials into objects of elegance and function. The people whispered that Athena herself, goddess of wisdom and craft, had guided his hands. To them, Daedalus was more than a man. He was a vessel of divine inspiration. But genius rarely walks an easy path. Daedalus's story is not simply about invention. It is about exile, envy, and the terrible cost of brilliance. Even in his earliest years, his talent drew both admiration and danger. The myth tells us he had a nephew, sometimes called Perdix, who showed a spark of the same creative gift. The boy, inspired by his uncle, shaped a fishbone into a saw, inventing one of the most important tools in human history. He bent a piece of iron into a compass, using it to draw perfect circles. His ideas were simple yet profound, proof that genius might pass from master to student. But instead of pride, Daedalus felt fear. If the boy surpassed him, what would become of his fame? Envy clouded his judgment. In a moment that would stain his soul, Daedalus pushed the boy from the heights of the Acropolis, hoping to end his rival's promise forever. Yet Athena, pitying the child, transformed him into a partridge before he struck the ground, sparing his life. From that day, the bird avoided high places, nesting close to the earth, a living reminder of Daedalus's crime. This story sets the tone for everything that follows. Daedalus was brilliant, but his brilliance was shadowed by insecurity. He could create wonders, but he could not master his own heart. His myth is not only about invention, it is about the fragile line between genius and hubris, between creation and destruction. Exiled from Athens for his deed, Daedalus fled to Crete, the island kingdom ruled by King Minos. Crete was a place of power and myth, a crossroads of gods and men, where bulls were sacred and the sea brought wealth. Minos welcomed Daedalus, for he recognized the value of genius. The king gave him patronage, honor, and tasks that required a mind unlike any other. Here, Daedalus would find both his greatest triumphs and the seeds of his tragedy. The Greeks told many tales of what Daedalus built on Crete. He designed statues that could move, mechanical wonders that blurred the line between life and art. He constructed palaces of unmatched beauty, filled with winding halls and hidden chambers. But it was one creation that would define him forever: the Labyrinth, a structure so vast and intricate that no one who entered could ever find their way out again. Before we reach that story, though, we must pause to reflect. The myth of Daedalus begins with promise and peril entwined. He was a man gifted beyond measure, but also flawed, bound by jealousy, capable of betrayal. His gift was to solve puzzles no one else could solve, but his curse was that his mind could never rest. In him, the Greeks saw the truth of invention, that to create is powerful, but power always carries danger. And so, Daedalus's story begins not with flight, but with envy, exile, and a genius that could not be contained. Soon his talents would serve kings, shape myths, and give birth to legends, but they would also set in motion events that would end with the image we all remember: wings of wax, a boy in the sky, and a fall that has echoed through time. On Crete, Daedalus found both refuge and destiny. Banished from Athens for his crime, he arrived on the island carrying nothing but his hands, his mind, and his guilt. King Minos, however, saw in him not an exile, but an opportunity. Crete was a land of wealth and mystery, but it was also a kingdom shadowed by divine punishment. Minos needed a man of invention, and in Daedalus he found his answer. The roots of this punishment stretched back to the gods themselves. Minos had prayed to Poseidon, lord of the sea, to send him a sign of divine favor. From the waves rose a magnificent white bull, stronger and more beautiful than any creature of earth. It was meant as a sacrifice, a gift to be returned to the god in gratitude. But Minos, awed by its splendor, could not bear to kill it. He kept the bull for himself and offered a lesser beast in its place. Poseidon saw this act as betrayal. To mock the god of the sea was to invite his wrath. And so he cursed Minos's house with a horror that would stain Crete forever. He inflamed the heart of Pasiphae, Minos's queen, with unnatural desire for the bull. Her yearning was unbearable, and her shame unending. In desperation, she turned to Daedalus. Here the myth grows darker. Pasiphae begged Daedalus to devise a way for her to fulfill this cursed desire, and Daedalus, bound by his role as servant to the king, perhaps unwilling, perhaps fascinated by the challenge, obeyed. He built a hollow wooden cow, lifelike in every detail, covered in the hide of a real animal. Pasiphae hid inside it, and through this deception she lay with the bull. From this union was born a creature unlike any other, the Minotaur, half man, half bull, a beast of violence and hunger. The child was an abomination, a living reminder of Minos's hubris and Poseidon's vengeance. Minos could not kill it, for it was of his blood, yet he could not let it live freely, for it was a danger to his people. And so he turned once more to Daedalus. "Build me a prison," he commanded, "one that could contain this horror forever." And Daedalus obeyed. He conceived a structure that was not merely walls and corridors, but a puzzle of stone. The labyrinth was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Its paths twisted and turned upon themselves, hallways doubled back in endless confusion, doors led to nothing, chambers spiraled into chambers. To enter was to be lost. To wander was to despair. To seek an exit was to find only walls upon walls until hope faded and madness took its place. Within this prison, the Minotaur was confined. Fed on flesh, feared by all, he became the hidden shame of Crete. Yet even a prison needs victims. The myth tells us that Athens, once defeated by Minos, was forced to send 7 young men and 7 maidens each year as tribute, condemned to enter the labyrinth and be devoured by the beast. Their cries echoed in the twisting corridors, unheard by the world outside. The labyrinth became more than stone. It was a symbol of despair, of punishment, of the price of defying the gods. For Minos, it was power, proof of his control over Athens. For Daedalus, it was triumph and guilt entwined. He had created the perfect prison, but in doing so, he had bound his own conscience. His genius served kings, but it also served cruelty. The Greeks saw in the labyrinth more than architecture. They saw the image of life itself, confusing, endless, filled with dead ends and hidden dangers. To walk through it was to mirror the soul's journey, struggling against fear, longing for freedom. The Minotaur within was not only a monster of flesh, but the embodiment of violence, lust, and hunger that dwells in us all. The labyrinth was not only on Crete, it was within the human heart. Daedalus, the creator, stood apart from this. He had built what no man could escape, and yet he himself was trapped, not in stone, but in the service of a king who demanded more than skill, who bent genius to his will. In this tension lies the essence of Daedalus, a man whose brilliance created wonders, but whose wonders became instruments of suffering. And yet, from this darkness also emerged another story, one that would intertwine with Daedalus's fate. For it was in the labyrinth that Theseus, prince of Athens, would one day descend. With the help of Ariadne, Minos's daughter, he would slay the Minotaur and end the cycle of tribute. The labyrinth that had been built to contain horror became the stage for heroism. But that is Theseus's tale. For Daedalus, the labyrinth was not victory but a turning point. Minos now held him tighter, a craftsman too valuable to release, a mind too dangerous to let wander. And Daedalus began to see that his genius was also his prison. He could build anything, but he could not build his own freedom. The story of the labyrinth lingers because it speaks to us even now. We too know what it is to walk in mazes of doubt, of fear, of choices that seem endless. We know what it is to face monsters that are half us, half something darker. The myth asks, who built your labyrinth, and how will you find your way out? For Daedalus, the answer lay not in stone, but in sky. But before he could rise, he would first fall into chains of his own. The labyrinth was not his prison. His prison was still to come. The labyrinth solved one problem only to create another. It silenced the shame of Crete and satisfied the vengeance of a god. But it also crowned Minos with an instrument so perfect that he could never let its maker go. Kings fear two things: the enemy outside their walls and the genius inside them. Daedalus, who could bend stone into confusion and make wood seem alive, was both treasure and threat. He knew how to build the maze. He also knew how to unbuild it. From the moment the last passage was sealed, his freedom was measured not in doors, but in suspicion. For a while, Minos disguised his fear as honor. He praised Daedalus in public, piled gifts upon him, and called him the marvel of his court. Work never stopped. The palace demanded new devices, hidden locks, singing automatons, chambers that cooled the summer heat, galleries whose light seemed to come from nowhere. Crete glittered with quiet miracles, and the name of its craftsman traveled farther than any ship. Yet every compliment tightened a cord. The harbor captains were told to watch the shore. The guard at the palace gate doubled. Messengers carried words that never named a prisoner, but everyone in Knossos knew the rule. Daedalus may wander, but he may not leave. Then came Theseus, then came Ariadne, then came the thread that undid the maze's secret. The tale was sung in every market. How a foreign prince braved the darkness, slew the bull-headed beast, and fled in the night with the king's daughter. A ship sailed, the tribute ended, and Crete woke to a silence that was not relief, but humiliation. Minos raged. He raged at Athens, at the gods, at the emptiness of the corridors he had paid to fill with fear. But he raged most of all at the mind that had made the labyrinth possible. For a man who can build a perfect prison can also whisper its undoing. Whether Daedalus had taught Ariadne the trick of the thread, or whether she found it in her own bright way, no longer mattered. In a king's anger, doubt is proof. The velvet of favor tore. The palace doors that had opened with polite smiles now shut with iron bars. Daedalus was seized, not with spectacle, but with efficient quiet. The way one locks away a dangerous tool. Icarus, his son, bright with the quick curiosity of youth, eyes always reaching beyond the horizon, was seized as well. Genius had become treason. Craft had become conspiracy. Father and son were carried to a high place of stone, where sea winds gnawed at the cliff and gulls cried at the edge of the sky. No dungeon is more complete than an island watched by a jealous king, an ocean patrolled by loyal captains, and a reputation that makes every fisherman your jailer. There is a peculiar silence to captivity when a maker is confined. A warrior may pace, a poet may sing, but a craftsman's hands itch for task. The cell at first was emptiness, stone, salt air, a barred window where sunrise came like a blade. The sea below, moving always, whispering routes and roads that a prisoner could not take. Icarus asked questions that hurt to answer. Will the king forgive us? Is there a tunnel in your mind you have not yet drawn? Can a man outthink an island? Daedalus answered with patience he did not feel, and stories he would later shape into caution. He knew something that youth could not. There are prisons that cannot be stormed, only solved. Time, that slow engineer, began to bring materials. The wind carried them. First a stray feather, then two, then a small drift of white at the corner of the window where seabirds nested in the cracks. A splinter of reed lodged in a drain. A coil of flax thread fell from a careless basket on some upper walkway and snagged on a nail. Pitch from a worker's pot left to harden near the parapet, softened again in a day of hard sun. These were not tools, not yet. They were the alphabet of escape, and Daedalus, who had spoken to wood and stone all his life, understood their grammar at a glance. He said nothing at first. He watched. He counted the gulls at morning and evening, mapped the updrafts, measured the angle of light on the cliff. He was not a magician. He was something rarer, the kind of mind that makes the improbable weigh less than a stone. Minos visited once. The king stood stiffly, ring heavy on his hand, gaze fixed on the sea rather than the man he had caged. There was no shouting. He offered a bargain that was not a bargain. Serve me and live, defy me and starve. Daedalus bowed with the ritual of survival. He did not promise. Minos left satisfied with his own performance, telling himself that fear and hunger will tame any talent. He did not understand that some talents grow sharper when starved. Nights lengthened into a rhythm. Icarus learned to be quiet when the guards changed, to gather what the wind gave, to listen to the slow arithmetic of his father's planning. They braided flax, twined reeds, warmed pitch with their breath and the window's small sun, tested knots with thumbs and teeth. Feathers were sorted by length and curve, the longest for lift, the sturdier for structure, down for skin. The work moved the way all true craft moves, patiently, invisibly. Refusing drama in favor of exactness. There were failures, pitch that cracked, thread that frayed, a lattice that bent wrong and taught a lesson no tutor could explain. But gradually a shape entered the room, unreal at first, then undeniable. A rib, then a spar, then a sweep like a question against the wall. In the pauses between work, regret came and went like the tide. Daedalus did not weep, he measured. He measured his guilt for the boy he had pushed from the heights of Athens. He measured the price of the wooden cow and the monstrous birth it had enabled. He measured the labyrinth, every turn of which still lived in his mind with painful clarity. He saw that every brilliance he had offered to power had returned with a shadow. A craftsman may intend, but a king will apply. The lesson thickened like resin in summer. Build as if your creation will be used against you, because one day it will be. This is not cynicism. It is conscience that has kept its eyes open. Icarus, meanwhile, dreamed forward. He asked what the world would look like from the height of gulls. He imagined islands as scattered coins on blue silk, ships like beetles, the sun a friend rather than a warning. His questions did not accuse the past. They hurried the future. Daedalus let him speak. Youth is a flame that should not be smothered, only taught the shapes of wind. But he also began to speak the sentences that would one day be called warnings. Do not fly too low. The sea's breath will wet the feathers and weigh you down. Do not fly too high. The sun will unmake what holds you. Do not race ahead of your shadow. Feel the air as a living thing, not an enemy, but not a servant. He did not yet say the word hubris. He put it in other words a son might hear. The guards laughed when the first gulls veered away from the window, as if insulted by a larger, paler bird nested within. They did not look long. Familiarity is a warden's sleep. Minos's captains reported calm seas and ordinary winds. No ship left without inspection, no fisherman set nets near the cliff. The king felt secure behind the mathematics of his island. He forgot that not all roads are water or stone. He forgot the one direction he had not forbidden because it seemed impossible. What makes a prison complete is also what makes it fragile. Certainty. When a jailer knows the limits of the world, he stops watching for the one who will redraw them. Daedalus had redrawn worlds before. He had bent halls into mazes and carved wood into living grace. Now he bent captivity into a workshop and carved air into a road. This was not sorcery, it was attention, patience, humility before materials. He did not command the elements, he learned them. He listened to how feathers want to lie, how reeds want to arc, how pitch wants to hold. The wings were not a defiance of nature, they were a conversation with it. There were moments of hesitation. The first time he strapped the frame to his arms, the weight seemed wrong, the balance unkind. He adjusted, shifted the center, added a brace here, loosened a lashing there. He tested lift by leaning into the window's throat of wind, feeling the tug, the eager pull, the whisper that said it might work. Icarus begged to try, and Daedalus denied him, then relented, then held the lashing so tight his fingers bled, while the boy felt the first mercy of air under bone. In those few heartbeats, fear and joy were indistinguishable. They always are when a boundary moves. The prison taught one final lesson before the day of flight. A gale came hard from the open sea, furious and clean, and for 3 days no work could be done. The wings hung from the wall, like ideas that might never be finished. Guards cursed the weather, gulls disappeared. Daedalus sat with his son and spoke of balance in a voice as steady as the rain. "Invention is not escape from limit," he said. "It is marriage to it. You do not conquer the wind, you learn its moods. You do not force the world to yield. You ask what it is willing to allow and build the rest from care." Icarus nodded and looked past the bars at a horizon that promised everything. The storm passed, as storms do. The air returned like a held breath released. When the morning at last arrived that held enough calm to trust, Daedalus understood what all makers know at the end of long work. There is a point when the thing you have built stops belonging to you. It becomes itself in the world, subject to its own strengths and all your miscalculations. He fastened the wing frames to Icarus first, not because it was wise, but because he remembered being young and would not strip youth of its due. He tied the knots slowly, checking each twist of cord, each seam of pitch, each row of feathers laid like scales. He spoke again the cautions: low is heavy, high is hunger, the middle path is flight, and kissed his son's brow with a steadiness he did not feel. Then he fastened his own harness and breathed once, twice, a craftsman's prayer without words. The guards on the lower wall looked up at a gull who wasn't, at a man-shaped bird stepping into the mouth of air. One shouted, another laughed, a third ran. By the time the message reached Minos's hall, 2 figures were already moving against the blue, one cautious and measured, the other light with a speed that seemed almost song. The island, so certain of its prison, watched as its boundaries were redrawn in feather and will. But that is the next chapter's work. The moment the stone gives way to sky, the first intoxication, the first mistake. For now the prison of the inventor has taught everything it could teach, that genius without conscience builds traps, that power without trust breeds cages, that patience can gather and escape from scraps, and that a father's wisdom must learn to speak in wind. The sea kept its secrets for a while longer, the wings waited for their trial, and the world held its breath for a flight that would be remembered for as long as people tell stories about the dangerous beauty of freedom. The cliffs of Crete stood silent at dawn, washed in gold by the rising sun. Below, the sea stretched endless and indifferent, the same sea that held them prisoner. Yet in the shadows of their cell, Daedalus and Icarus prepared for a journey no man had ever dared. They were not sailors boarding a ship, nor soldiers marching to war. They were prisoners about to entrust their lives to air, to trust in wings shaped by human hands. The wings themselves were a paradox, fragile yet powerful, ordinary in their materials, yet extraordinary in design. Reeds gave them structure, feathers their surface, flax their strength, and wax their bond. They did not look divine. They looked like the careful work of a craftsman, a patchwork of scavenged scraps stitched together by patience and necessity. And yet, within them lay the possibility of freedom, the audacity to rise where walls and seas could no longer reach. Daedalus moved with the calm of a man who knows there is no room left for error. Every cord he tied, every knot he tightened, was not just craft, it was prayer. He tested the weight, the balance, the way the air caught the feathers. He had built countless wonders for kings, but never had he built something where failure meant death, not only for him, but for the boy who stood beside him, his son, wide-eyed and trembling with excitement. Icarus looked at the wings not as tools, but as dreams come alive. His young heart was full of wonder, not fear. For him, the wings were not symbols of desperation, but of possibility. They were not escape, they were flight. He gazed at the horizon where sky met water, imagining the view from above, the thrill of becoming more than human, of soaring where only birds had been. His father's cautions were distant echoes compared to the roaring desire to leap. Before they stepped into the wind, Daedalus spoke. His words were not commands, but pleas shaped by love. He told Icarus to keep to the middle path. Fly too low, and the sea's spray would weigh down the feathers. Fly too high, and the sun's heat would soften the wax. Balance was the key, moderation the salvation. The middle way, neither reckless nor timid, was the only path to survival. These warnings were not only practical advice, they were a father-axe attempt to teach life's greatest lesson in the span of a few breaths, that freedom requires discipline, that ambition must be tempered by humility, that the world has limits which even genius cannot break. Daedalus knew too well the cost of ignoring limits. He had seen envy drive him to murder, pride trap him in service, invention bind him in chains. He wanted his son to learn from his mistakes, to carry wisdom as well as wings. Icarus nodded, but his eyes were already on the sky. Youth does not easily understand caution. To be told not to fly too high is to awaken the very hunger to rise. To be warned of danger is to feel the thrill of defiance. Perhaps Daedalus knew this, but still he tried. Warnings are the only gift a father can give when the world itself is about to open. At last, they fastened the wings. Daedalus tested his own, moving them slowly, feeling the push of air, adjusting until they caught the wind. He helped Icarus with his straps, checking every knot twice, as if he could bind safety into the cords. Then they stood at the cliff's edge, where the sea crashed below, and the horizon waited. The guards were far behind, their laughter of disbelief carried faintly on the wind. And then they leapt. The first moments were chaos, wind tearing at feathers, the weight of their bodies pulling down, the cliff face rushing past. But then the air caught, the wings lifted, and suddenly stone and prison were behind them. They were in the sky, held not by chains, but by the invisible arms of wind. For Daedalus, it was a moment of relief, of concentration. Every beat of his wings was measured, controlled, adjusted. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, on the steady middle height where the air was kind, where the sea could not claim him and the sun could not burn him. He flew as a craftsman, carefully, humbly, with respect for the forces that bore him. For Icarus, it was ecstasy, the rush of air in his hair, the world spread beneath him like a painted map, the sea glittering like 1,000 jewels, the islands scattered like stepping stones in a vast blue. He cried out, not in fear, but in laughter. For the first time, he was not earthbound. He was more than human, free in a way mortals had only dreamed. The warnings of his father faded beneath the roar of his own heartbeat. And so they flew together, father and son, prisoner and dreamer, leaving behind the labyrinth, the king, the prison, the chains. Their path was not on the earth nor on the sea, but in the sky itself. The wings had done what no dungeon could stop, what no king could forbid. They had turned desperation into freedom, genius into flight. But within that flight lay the seeds of triumph and tragedy both. For while Daedalus kept to the middle way, Icarus's eyes were already lifting higher. They moved with the morning, two figures etched against a pale, widening sky, following a path no map had drawn. The island fell away, cliffs shrinking to teeth of stone, fortress walls to chalk lines, the palace of Minos to a child's toy left on a ledge. Sea opened in every direction, a vast sheet of hammered light that flexed and furrowed with the wind. Beneath them the world was distance, within them the world was breath. Wings whispered and answered, beat and balanced, learned the grammar of lift in real time, word by trembling word. Daedalus flew first, not to lead, but to measure. Every movement of his shoulders translated to a tremor along the spars, every tilt of his wrist to a subtle change in the angle of the outer veins. He felt the wind as a living thing, its push and give, its hollows and sudden fists, the invisible rivers that slid down from cool heights and broke like surf against pockets of warm air rising from the water. Craft had taught him many languages. None were as precise as this. He kept to the altitude he had tested from the window's throat, neither seduced by the clean, thin blue above, nor bullied by the heavy breath of waves below. Between hazard and hunger, he traced a middle line. Icarus ranged near, a pale arc to his father's measured chord. At first, he matched the rhythm, eyes darting between horizon and hands, lips parted in a smile that kept reforming itself as if wonder had to be constantly renewed. He learned quickly how to let the wing catch, how not to fight the gust that wanted to lift, how to lean through the air as if rounding a corner in a room with no walls. A tern jumped from below, rose on the same updraft, circled once, twice, and vanished toward the sun. Icarus laughed aloud at the kinship, astonished to discover that the sky accepted him as it accepted birds, contingent not on birth, but on balance. They held a course that slanted along the island chain, the scattered backs of sleeping beasts, each rimmed with foam. The air smelled of salt and resin, and now and then the faint sweetness of thyme released from dry slopes by the warming day. A fishing boat cut a thin, dark seam through the water, and the men aboard shaded their eyes, mouths open, oars stilled. Daedalus felt their astonishment in his bones and kept his gaze forward. Marvel is a kind of gravity. If you look down too long, you fall toward it. Time, that stubborn companion, softened. Minutes became muscle memory, an expansion and contraction, a conversation of weight and force. The pain along Daedalus's forearm settled into a steady ache. The joints in his shoulders announced their limits and then stabilized around them. When the first true thermals began to lift from the warming islands, he rode them gratefully, allowing the column of heated air to carry him a little higher before sliding sideways into cooler stream. The wings, so recently crude and improbable in a stone cell, now behaved like instruments, still imperfect, yes, but interpretable, their quirks readable in the way a craftsman reads the knots in maple or the grain in marble. Icarus's confidence grew as surely as the day. He tested small liberties, a longer glide than his father allowed himself, a tighter banking turn to feel the edge of stall without crossing it, a brief closing of the eyes to memorize the feel of flight as a proprioception rather than a view. Each experiment returned him intact, buoyant, widened. Joy wants to push its perimeter. A gull cried, and he cried back, not in imitation but in response, as if the air itself had asked him a question he alone could answer. Daedalus called across the wind when he had to, signals minimal and clear. A raised hand for caution, a tap to the harness when a lashing needed checking. 2 fingers downward when the lift thinned and they should descend a breath. He did not squander words. The warnings spoken at the cliff were in the feathers now, in the measured reach of each stroke. Flying was its own instruction. The body learned what the tongue could not compel. Mid-morning brought the bright danger, a band of calm air that looked harmless from above and felt like sleep from within. The sea below, glassed and gleaming, offered no texture for the eye. With no ripples to read and no wind to bite, balance dulled, and once lively wings sagged into habit. Daedalus forced himself to count, beats grouped by fives to keep mind and muscles awake, adjusted trim, and aimed for the faint haze where distant land heated the sky. In the pause between breaths, memory stirred, a workshop silence right before a chisel slips, the deceptive ease that always precedes error. He spoke once, sharp as a flint strike. Icarus flinched, then corrected, his posture resetting from ease to attention. Dangers often arrive dressed as comfort. They found the next island's lift and rose with it, spiraling like hawks. In that slow coil, Daedalus allowed himself a glance. His sun's face was lit from below by the sea, from above by the sky, and from within by something that had no obvious source. Pride came, cleaned of its old sediment of envy and fear. Grief came with it, the anticipatory kind that attends every father's joy because joy is risk made visible. He turned away before either feeling could pull him off his line. The day opened wider. Sun hammered the water into coins. Heat climbed, softened the pitch along the feathering seams, released a smell like warm honey that made the air feel intimate. Daedalus checked the bindings and found them sound. He had mixed the wax with a thread of resin for strength, had layered the feathers so each one nested over the next like tiles against rain. Craft is trust, in hours already spent. Still, even the best joinery is a treaty with force, not a conquest of it. Treaties can be broken by weather or by will. Icarus drifted higher to taste the blue, returned obediently at his father's lifted palm, then drifted again as if drawn by a music only he could hear. The space above was cleaner, less cluttered by the grit of salt and the stray ash that ships carry in their breath. It felt like truth, and could not be, because all altitudes lie in their own ways. Up close, the sun's warmth was not a caress, but a pressure. Feathers that preferred the temperate began to complain in whispers only fingertips could hear. He ignored the first whisper, as youth does, and chased the next bright yard of air. A pair of kites appeared from the north, riding a ridge of invisible current with a laziness born of perfect efficiency. They approached, inspected these awkward newcomers with quick tilts of the head, and slid away. For a moment, Icarus followed, matching their arc, delighted to be recognized by creatures he had always loved from below. He did not see how narrowly their flight threaded between too cold and too hot, how their feathers were not glued but grown, full of micro-hooks and oils that made them living machines. He matched form but not material. It is an old human trick and an old human danger. Daedalus called him down again, gentler this time, and Icarus obeyed long enough to show that obedience was possible. Then the wind changed its handwriting. A low, warm current pushed from the south, met a cooler cross-breath and braided into a staircase the eye could not see. If you stepped exactly on the treads, you rose with barely a pull. If you stepped between, you wobbled and had to right your balance back into the air quickly, precisely, or fall. Daedalus read it, adjusted, taught with the angle of his wings rather than with speech. Icarus felt it as invitation. His next arc, higher than the last, was clean, then cleaner, then just a little dirty at the edge where a feather complained and the wax along a seam gave the smallest sigh. He grinned into the heat. The sigh went unheard. They crossed a channel where the water deepened from turquoise to an indigo that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. A pod of dolphins stitched the surface, appearing and vanishing in a rhythm that felt like encouragement. Off the starboard distance, though starboard meant little up here, a ship's square sail bellied full. A boy on deck pointed. A woman shaded her eyes with a jar-wet hand. The helmsman crossed himself for luck or fear. Word would run along the island chain by nightfall. 2 men flew. Word always runs faster than feet. Fatigue arrived the way it often does in beautiful places, quietly, almost polite. A tremor began in Daedalus's forearms and turned to heat in the shoulder blades. He timed short rests to the updrafts, letting the columns carry weight for a few breaths before working again. He signaled Icarus to do the same. The boy nodded, settled, rested, and then, because rest restores desire, pushed for a higher stair. A seam along his right wing brightened with sun, softened by a degree that is nothing on the ground, and a lit fuse in the sky. A single drop bulged where pitch and wax had married with care and now discussed separation. The drop trembled but held. The father saw the shine but not its cause. He could not smell the sweetening air from there. He read the boy's posture instead, the small electric tilt that comes when joy stops being joy and begins to be victory. He raised both hands, palms down, the gesture they had used to mean settle, stay, trust the middle. Icarus dipped, dutiful, and the drop cooled, withdrew, forgot its brief ambition to run. The treaty held a little longer. They flew on, island to island, line to line, until the sun climbed to a point that erased shadows and turned edges indistinct. The world at noon is blunt. Decisions made then are simple and therefore dangerous. Daedalus began to angle the course west by north, toward a larger shape that promised wells and shade, and a slope where wings could be repaired without haste. He felt the plan as relief, the way a stone carver feels the final clean pass of a rasp before polishing, work done well enough to last until tomorrow. But plans are mortal, and noon is a persuader. The height above them looked like freedom, not hazard. Heat felt like blessing, not warning. Icarus lifted again, and this time the climb was not a sip, but a draught. The air thinned and smoothed, lovely, treacherous. The feathers, designed by patience to share load along their overlaps, began to lift at the tips like scales teased by a careless hand. The wax's scent turned richer, the way honey smells when it is almost, but not quite, too close to fire. A second drop gathered, let go, and fell unseen to the sea. Daedalus shouted, not with anger, but with the terror that lives inside love. The words scattered in the wind, the meaning reached. Icarus looked back, raised a hand, smiled and flattened his glide to show he could, to show he was still listening, to show this height didn't own him. For a dozen breaths, he was perfect, centered, calm, exactly on the line where the air is strong enough to hold and cool enough to keep. Perfection is seductive. It suggests it will stay. He tasted it and wanted more. What came next was small in the way most catastrophes begin, a harmless gleam along the seam, a feather quiver that would have been nothing lower, a lift that arrived just as a cross breath stuttered. He corrected a hair late, and the correction asked for another. Heat licked gentle as approval. The wax remembered what it was before work made it law-abiding. It desired to flow. It flowed. Another feather loosened. Then another. They did not tear away in drama. First they rose like a shiver. Then they slid with awful grace. Icarus felt the wing's voice change from a note he could hum to a chord he did not know how to resolve. He glanced down and saw the sea too bright, too near, the islands too far to be casual. Panic reached for his throat and almost closed his breath, but he fought it down, the body's oldest art, and did what his father had taught. He eased, not jerked, reduced angle, sought density rather than height, asked the air for mercy instead of demanding it for triumph. For a handful of heartbeats, the world listened. The fall became a steepening glide. Then a glide became a line that might be drawn towards safety if safety had time to move closer. Daedalus had already turned, already rising on the last of the thermal to meet him, wings laboring, every tendon singing its limit. He did not think in words. He thought in lengths and angles, In the distance between now and the small, low slope of scrub that might welcome a hard landing, in the distance between his son's breath and the one after, he reached a height that hurt and flattened to give speed away to position. The craft that had saved them both for hours now made a plea of its own. Respect me, and I will carry you one more time. If this were a world of guarantees, the next moments would be simple. But the wind wrote an amendment that no one signed. A cross-breath arrived, trivial at the surface, multiplied at elevation, and introduced a wobble just as Icarus's right wing lost another set of barbs. The wobble turned to yaw. Yaw asked roll to join. Roll asked gravity to lead. The horizon tilted, the sea stepped up. Icarus fought, and for an instant won, he truly did. Then the seam along the primary veins unzipped with a sigh so soft it could have been love. He dropped. No scream at first, only a sudden quickness of air, the sound of many small things parting company. Feathers tore away in a soft storm. His left wing held, which made the spin worse. He did not think of warnings or pride. He thought of the way the wind had first accepted him and how to fall as a flyer rather than as a stone. He drew his limbs in, then out, hunting a posture that might turn tumble to arc. For a breath, he found it. A curving, desperate line toward water that looked like a decision rather than a sentence. Daedalus saw all of it. Saw and could not arrive. Distance is honest in the sky. Love cannot shorten it. He shouted his son's name and tasted salt that was not spray. The sea opened its 1,000 hands. The boy struck. A white burst, a circle widening, wings scattering like a flock suddenly without a leader. Silence took the place where laughter had been, but that belongs to the next telling. The flight is chapter ends, where beauty and danger meet without negotiation, with a father still aloft, a son below the glittering surface, and the sky itself refusing to say whether it is mercy or trial. The air, which had borne them so far, continued its impartial work. Above the ache in his shoulders and the fracture in his heart, Daedalus kept flying, because bodies must. He turned toward the nearest shore. The line he had chosen before noon convinced him it would always be noon. The wings still answered. The world, merciless and magnificent, went on. The sun had climbed to its highest throne when the boy's joy became his undoing. The warnings of Daedalus, patient and desperate, had been clear. Do not fly too high, for the sun will soften the wax. Do not fly too low, for the sea will drag you down. Stay between. Balance is freedom's only safeguard, but youth rarely believes in boundaries. Where the father saw limits, the son saw only horizons. And in that hunger to go higher, Icarus forgot that wings are not born, but made. As he rose, the air thinned, smooth and silent. The sea became a distant shimmer. The islands shrank into stepping stones of green and gold. Icarus felt himself more god than man, untethered, unbound. The sun, brilliant and blinding, filled his eyes with fire. It was no longer a warning. It was a promise, a crown waiting to be claimed. Each beat of his wings lifted him closer until the air grew warmer and the faint scent of resin and wax filled the wind. Daedalus saw the danger first. He had been watching, measuring, always counting the delicate balance of forces. He saw the shimmer along the boy's wings, the slight lag in their response. He cried out, calling Icarus back, his voice torn apart by the wind. But the boy only laughed, intoxicated by the rush of freedom. To be told to descend was, to him, to be told to surrender. The joy of flight was too sharp, too sweet. Then it began, the slow betrayal of material. A bead of wax, clear as glass, loosened and fell. One feather trembled, then slipped, whirling away into the air. Another followed. The wings still held, but less surely, less obediently. Icarus noticed only when it was too late. He tried to steady himself, to angle downward, but the warmth was relentless. Wax softened, cords strained, and feathers came loose in clumps, drifting like snow against the blue. Fear replaced joy. He flailed, beating harder, thinking strength could replace structure. But wings are not arms, and flight does not obey desperation. The more he struggled, the less the air listened. The frame twisted, the feathers tore free, and the sky released him. The fall was not instant. It was a long, terrible descent, a tumbling arc where sky and sea spun around him. He saw the world tilt, saw the islands spin, saw his father far above, still struggling to reach him. His cries broke into the wind, carried away before they could reach the ears that needed to hear them. He fell past gulls that screamed and veered, past drifting feathers that mocked the wings he had lost. The sea grew larger, nearer, inevitable. Daedalus followed as far as he could, wings laboring, heart-breaking. He called the boy's name, his voice raw with grief, but the sky gave no mercy. He saw Icarus vanish into the glittering surface, a white splash, a widening ring. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the water closed, calm and indifferent, swallowing the boy as though he had never flown at all. The sea where Icarus fell took his name. The ancients called it the Icarian Sea, a reminder that even in death, stories preserve what the waves erase. Daedalus circled above, torn between despair and survival. The wings that still bore him could not carry him into grief, only into exile. He flew on, carrying the memory of his son, not as triumph, but as weight. He had given Icarus wings, but he could not give him wisdom. He had given him freedom, but he could not give him restraint. This was the father's torment, the craftsman's sorrow. That invention without humility becomes ruin. The fall of Icarus has never ceased to echo. Artists painted it, poets mourned it, philosophers drew from it warnings about pride and ambition. Yet beneath all those interpretations lies something simple, a boy who wanted to fly, who tasted the sky, and who paid with his life. His tragedy is ours, for we too reach higher than we should, dazzled by the brilliance above us, blind to the dangers that wait. And yet in his fall there is also a strange kind of beauty, for though he fell, he also flew. For one radiant moment, Icarus was free, not bound by kings or prisons, not earthbound, but soaring. His death was tragedy, but his flight was wonder. And perhaps that is why we remember him, not only for his fall, but for the dream that lifted him before it. After the circle on the water closed, and the sea gave back only feathers, Daedalus turned away from the place that would be named for his son. He could not bury Icarus. The ocean keeps its own graves and marks them with nothing but sun and salt. All he could do was fly until the ache in his shoulders blurred with the ache in his chest, and the coastline ahead offered a slope gentle enough to welcome a landing that did not trust the ground. He chose a spit of rock and scrub, folded the wings, with the tenderness one uses for a wounded thing, and lay with his face in the earth, a long while tasting dust until the taste was realer than memory. When he rose, the sky had already resumed its ordinary labor. Gulls worked the wind, and fishermen worked the tide. The world does not halt for grief. It absorbs it. There are stories that say he stopped first on a small island, set up a cairn of stones, and spoke his son's name to the wind until the wind seemed to carry it faithfully. Others say he carved a little figure from driftwood. No grand statue, only a boy caught in the instant before laughter, and set it on a rock where foam would touch it twice a day. In either telling, he did the only work left to a craftsman when work cannot restore what was lost. He shaped an object that could hold a fraction of pain, so the rest could be born in the body without breaking it. He did not put the wings back on. He bound them to a branch, and for a day they were a ragged shrine, feathers whispering what had been dared and what had been spent. The sea lane still belonged to Minos, but air had taught Daedalus to read distances differently. He traveled by piecemeal coast, night in a cave, morning across a narrow channel, afternoon in the lee of a promontory, moving westward to where rumors placed a king less jealous than the one he had fled. Sicily rose as a dark blue line, then a fragrance, smoke from cooking fires. resin and citrus, a hint of sulfur where the earth breathed warm. He came ashore among shepherds who watched him as if a story had walked out of their grandmothers' mouths. They gave him sheep's milk and bread and a place near the coals, and asked nothing he could not bear to answer. Grief makes a man old in a day. They read the lines and respected their silence. The land he entered was ruled by Cocalus, a king with a cautious eye and a talent for hospitality. The court he kept was not glittering like Knossos. It was practical and watchful, its wealth in storehouses rather than in painted walls. When Daedalus named himself, plainly, without flourish, the king did not startle. The name had traveled faster than any ship. Cocalus saw that a man who could build a maze could also straighten a river, repair a harbor, raise a roof that would outlast a dynasty. He offered shelter without chains, bread without questions, and a workshop with light on three sides. It was more mercy than Daedalus had expected, and less than he deserved, and thus exactly the measure that would let him live. He began to work again, not to forget the boy, but to keep his hands from turning grief inward. He built small at first, hinges that did not squeal in the night, a press that gave more oil from the same olives, a winch that lifted stones with less outcry from the back. People came with practical problems and left surprised not by magic, but by how much attention felt like care. When the king asked for more, bridges, storage vaults cool enough to keep grain sweet through summer, a bath that held the same pleasant heat without devouring half a forest, Daedalus answered with designs that respected material as much as aspiration. Ingenuity, newly disciplined by loss, became almost tenderness. He no longer sought to astonish, he sought to repair. But the world remembers its debts, and kings keep lists of what is theirs. Back on Crete, Minos wore humiliation like a garment he could not remove. The labyrinth was empty, the tribute ended, his daughter gone with a foreigner who would abandon her on a different shore. The craftsman he had gilded and caged had flown where no man should have power to fly. Rage wants a narrative that makes it reasonable. Minos chose one. Justice pursued. He took to the sea with ships that carried more crew than sails and a clever test in his hand. A spiral shell, pierced at both ends, and a promise to reward any city that could thread it from mouth to mouth without breaking the curve. A riddle with a name embedded in it. The shell arrived in Sicily as it had in other ports, an object passed from palm to palm with a smile that hid a net. Cocalus received it at supper and turned it in his fingers as men do when they are thinking of a different object entirely. He took it to the one person in his house who would despise a puzzle too simple and distrust a puzzle too hard. Daedalus looked at the shell, at the narrow tunnel that snaked in tight logarithms through its body, and recognized both problem and messenger. He asked for a drop of honey, a thin thread, and an ant. He tied the thread to the ant, smeared the shell's rim with sweetness, and set his small laborer to work from the far mouth. Drawn by the scent, the ant solved the labyrinth no man's wire could solve. When it emerged, the thread sang a single long curve through the shell. There, answer enough to tell Minos exactly where the maker of mazes had hidden his hands. News travels with the wind, but wrath travels with oars. Minos' ships blackened the horizon. His heralds demanded guest right to speak of justice. Cocalus met them with welcome and a blade under the cloth. The king of Crete announced his claim. The craftsman belonged to him, by contract if not by kindness, by fear if not by right. Cocalus smiled as hosts smile and suggested a bath after so great a journey, steam to ease the shoulders that had commanded so many days at sea. Minos agreed. A man who has always been obeyed mistakes courtesy for surrender. What happened then depends on which old man by which fire tells you the tale. Some say Cocalus, daughters, admiring Daedalus, gentle cleverness, and perhaps despising Minos, hardness, poured boiling water into the pipes so that steam scalded the king where he could not protect himself. Others say Daedalus himself arranged the vents so that heat narrowed to a lance. Still others, gentler, claim Minos slipped and broke his neck in a room tiled to betray a heavy foot. In all tellings, the Sea King who once fed a monster with foreign children died far from his painted halls, undone not by sword or storm, but by craft, applied to the quiet places of a house. It is a tidy symmetry that would please a poet and worry a philosopher. Daedalus did not exult. He did not go down to view the body or boast of a trap that was only half his. He returned to the workshop and put his hands on wood until the tremor left them. Justice has a way of staining even those who did not pour the dye. He had learned on Crete that making instruments for power binds you to what power does with them. In Sicily, he learned that making instruments against power carries its own, different weight. He carried both. Time passed, which is to say it worked on him. He built and mended. He taught the king's artisans to think of force as something to be gentled rather than conquered. From a hillside, he set channels that persuaded water to turn millstones and irrigate orchards with a minimum of quarrel. He framed roofs to breathe, making summer airy and winter bearable. He devised a harbor light that did not need a man to feed it every hour, by arranging mirrors to borrow a day's last fire for a watch or two more. In each device there was a humility that had not been in the labyrinth. This is what the world already wishes to do. We will help it along its will. When a traveling priest of Apollo came through, carrying a lyre missing one small peg, Daedalus carved a dowel that would not split under tension and listened while the man tuned his instrument. The note that had once struck Daedalus as an adornment to dinner now reached him as if the air itself were remembering how to be kind. He repaired the lyre and, as payment, asked only that the priest speak a blessing over a pair of objects wrapped in cloth and kept on a high shelf. The priest obliged. The objects were wings, the remnants of Sicily's first shrine to a failed miracle. Feathers had been replaced, pitch renewed. He would never strap them on again, but he could not throw them away. Some tools are not for use anymore. They are for remembering the price of using them. There are other versions of his wanderings. Some have him journey north to Cumae, where he built a temple to Apollo on a promontory, and hung his wings upon its wall with an inscription that asked any passerby to consider prudence and praise the god. Some have him summoned by a tyrant to build fortifications so cunning they could not be breached, and declining, at last, to make another maze for another Minos. In those tellings he chose smaller work, a hinged cradle that could rock a colicky child without waking a mother, a balance that taught merchants the difference between profit and theft, a stair that seemed steep but asked less of old knees. Greatness turned inward is not surrender, it is repair becoming ethics. He took on apprentices. He taught them the art that had nearly ruined him, how to see what a material wants to be, how to make a joint that serves its load, how to test before trusting, how to place beauty last in the order of operations, and thereby make it inevitable rather than deliberate. The youngest of them, impatient and bright, would sometimes press him for advice about glory. He would gesture toward the harbor, where the sea kept its own counsel, and say that glory is a kind of wind that blows hardest when you least need it. Better to learn where the currents are gentle and the landings are friendly. He did not tell them the whole story. You can warn a boy of heat until your voice breaks. The sun will still be his own teacher. Now and then a sailor from the east would arrive with a rumor dressed as news. Knossos had a new fresco. Athens had a new story. Ariadne had been abandoned, then rescued, then made a goddess. The labyrinth's empty corridors were filling with dust and legend. Daedalus listened as a carpenter listens to a blade's complaint, curious, a little sad, and then returned to the work at hand. The past is a tool you can hone, or a weight you can drag. He was learning slowly to choose the former. He did, at last, permit himself a memorial more lasting than a pile of stones. On a headland where the wind came clean, he raised a slender column, nothing grand, and set atop it a small bronze boy, not falling, not flying, but standing with his face turned toward the horizon, one hand over his eyes to shade them, the other held out as if feeling the direction of an invisible current. At the base he etched no boast, only a brief line about caution and the cost of mistaking height for freedom. Weather worked on the metal. Salt loved it. The figure greened into the color of patient grief. Fishermen began to tip their caps to it as they went out and as they returned. Some said catches were better when the boy had been greeted. Belief makes its own currents. There were nights, of course, when memory refused to be engineered into harmlessness. A certain slant of heat across the workshop would bring back the smell of warming resin. A whitened ripple on the bay would pulse like a circle widening. On those nights, he walked among the olive trees until his feet made peace with ground again, then returned to the bench and chose a task that required steady attention but brought no danger to anyone. Planning a board to a thickness that light could almost pass through, or fitting a hinge that needed to swing without sound. Grief is not conquered, it is given work. When strangers praised his Sicilian devices, he accepted the words and filed them away like offcuts. Praise had led him too close to kings. He preferred gratitude that ended in a handshake and a loaf of bread. If anyone brought him a commission that smelled of fear or domination, a door to keep people out rather than weather, a wall to confound rather than shelter, he declined with courtesy that was firm enough to be a lesson. "Let machines serve life," he would say gently. "Leave mastery to those who think they have time to pay for it." He aged in a way that made the lines of his face look like joins rather than cracks. His hands remained clever. His shoulders remembered the cost of asking them to bear wings. He spoke sometimes, rarely, of the boy on the cliff who had asked him whether the world looked different from above. He would answer as if the question were freshly asked. Yes, it does. And no, that difference is not always an improvement. From the ground, you can smell time after heat. From the air, you cannot. From the ground, you learn where wells are by the gossip of women. From the air, you guess and are often wrong. The sky is generous, but it does not love us. The middle way still waits. Most of life lives there. Minos's death, when it was finally told plainly and without embroidery, brought no feast to Sicily. Cocculus wore a solemn face and sent the body home with honors enough to quiet rumor. The sea accepted the ship that bore the king and said nothing, as seas do. Daedalus stood on the breakwater and watched the sail dwindle into a white idea and then into nothing. He felt no triumph there either. The story of the Labyrinth had held too many people. Victory would never be clean in that house. He bowed to the wind as if to a stern teacher, then turned back toward work that would not make a ballad and might make a life easier. In the end, the wanderings of Daedalus were not about distance. They were about radius, how far a man can travel within himself between hubris and humility, between the hunger to astound and the will to repair. He had left Athens as a genius jealous of a boy. He left Crete as a servant of a king and the father of a story that would outlive him. In Sicily, he became something rarer, a craftsman who has learned the ethics of his gift, who knows that every invention must ask first, whom will this serve and at what cost? There were mornings when he would stand in the doorway of the workshop and lift his palms to the light, as if feeling the temperature of a forge. He would remember the weight of feathers and the language of wind, and he would not regret the knowledge, only the price. He would say the name, quietly once, and then begin the day's making. If anyone asked him in that last season of work to tell them the true lesson of Icarus, he would not speak of obedience or disobedience, of sons and fathers, of pride or punishment. He would point to a beam properly joined and say, balance is the only miracle. Hold it, and anything can stand. Lose it, and even wings become falling. So he wandered, which is to say he stayed, which is to say he moved inward to a room where tools hang in their places, and the door is open to anyone who needs something made well and safely. He lived long enough to see young men he had trained teach boys who would never know the name of the man behind their teacher's patience. This is how craft survives disaster, by going quiet and durable, by becoming habit rather than legend. The sea kept its secrets, the sky kept its distances, and Daedalus, who had once bent both to his will, learned to live under them with a dignity that required no witness. The story does not end there, but the road bends. What remains is not a final invention, but a reckoning we inherit. How to love ambition without being eaten by it. How to make things that serve life rather than enthrone kings. How to remember that every height tempts and every fall teaches, and most of what matters is built in the long, patient middle between. In that middle, the father walks the shoreline some evenings, looks out over the water that bears his son's name, and lets the wind take the rest of the words he no longer needs to say. The story of Daedalus and Icarus did not sink with the boy into the Icarian Sea. It did not remain locked in Crete or Sicily or the workshops of a grieving father. It took flight again, carried by poets, painters, philosophers and dreamers, who saw in it not only a tragedy of two men, but a mirror of humanity itself. For what is myth, if not a story large enough to contain all our hungers, all our warnings, all our contradictions? Icarus became more than a boy who flew too high. He became the image of ambition unrestrained, of joy untethered, of the human impulse to go beyond. The Greeks told the story to remind themselves of hybris, that dangerous pride that offends the gods and brings ruin. To them, the fall of Icarus was proof that limits exist for a reason, that the middle path, neither too high nor too low, is where life is lived safely. The myth was a cautionary tale, a reminder that even genius and invention are nothing without humility. But centuries later, others told it differently. The Romans, heirs to Greek culture, saw Icarus as a warning to their own empire. Reach too far, and the sun of ambition will melt your wings. In the Middle Ages, moralists used him as an example of disobedience, the child who ignored his father's wisdom and paid the price. Artists painted him falling, a figure of sorrow and folly. To them, the sea was punishment, and the feathers scattered across the water were fragments of a broken will. Yet something curious happened in modern times. The story shifted, not entirely but subtly. Poets like W.H. Auden, in his poem Musée des Beaux-Arts, noted how the fall of Icarus passed almost unnoticed by the world. A ploughman kept ploughing, a ship sailed calmly on, while a boy drowned in the sea. This version no longer blamed the boy alone. It showed how life moves on, how tragedy is invisible to those not touched by it. The fall became not only about pride, but about indifference, about how the world does not stop for our sorrows. For others, Icarus is no longer only a fool, he is also a hero. To fly at all was a miracle. To rise higher, even recklessly, was an act of defiance against limits, a glimpse of the divine. Modern readers sometimes ask, is it worse to fall for aiming too high or never to fly at all? In that question, Icarus becomes a symbol not of failure, but of courage. The courage to risk, to desire, to dream. Think of how the story speaks today. We live in an age of invention greater than Daedalus ever imagined. We reach into space with rockets. We dive into the smallest particles. We shape life itself with science. Each discovery is a feather added to our wings. Each invention asks us the same question Daedalus asked his son. Will you balance your flight, or will you rise too high and melt? Climate change, artificial intelligence, nuclear fire, are these not our suns, burning closer the more we climb? The myth is not ancient, it is present. It warns us that genius without wisdom, freedom without discipline, ambition without restraint, leads to the same fall. And yet we still celebrate Icarus. His laughter in the sky is something we cannot forget. It is the cry of every dreamer who refuses the prison, who refuses the narrow path, who believes the human spirit was meant for more. Perhaps the myth is not only a warning, but also a paradox, that to live fully is to risk falling, and that a life without flight is no life at all. Daedalus remains with us too. He is the craftsman's voice, the reminder that invention must be guided by conscience, that creation is a responsibility as much as it is a gift. He tells us that balance, patience, and humility are the true wings that last, while haste and arrogance unravel. He reminds us that a father's wisdom may not always be heard, but it must always be spoken. And so the myth endures because it is both. It is caution and inspiration, tragedy and triumph, sorrow and wonder. It says, do not fly too high, and also dare to fly at all. It says, respect the limits of the world, and also the sky is open to those who try. Perhaps that is why the image of Icarus falling still haunts our imagination, because we know that he fell, but we also know that for one radiant moment he flew, and between the prison of stone and the grave of the sea, he tasted freedom. That taste, as brief as it was, is what we all long for. And it is why, after thousands of years, we still tell his story, not only to warn ourselves of the fall, but to remember the flight.